we do no service to the project of giving Africa its just historical due if we continue to plant our feet in one region of the continent and look outward. One of the problems in world history is people plant their feet somewhere in Eurasia and they look outward at the rest of the world when they try to write their world history books. All we've done is plant our feet a little farther southward, not in the Levant or the Mesopotamia or Southern Europe, but in Egypt, to make Egypt the source for the rest of Africa of some abstract quality or maybe mythical quality of civilization, is still to treat the rest of Africa as peripheral to world history, to continue to treat the accomplishment of the rest of Africa's peoples as derivative. Africans everywhere on the continent, well, the further you get away from the middle of the world, the more you are, but anyway, so if you live up in the Arctic and Siberia, you're kind of getting toward the edge. But Africans nearly everywhere on the continent were not off the edge of history. Instead, they were innovative, contributors in integral ways, and participants in each of the major transitions of long Holocene age. That was my sort of topic for last time. And they did not need some special people in one part of the continent to bring these developments to them. Africans in West and Central Africa were historical and technological innovators in their own right, possessing, for example, ceramic technology long before Egypt and even longer, maybe before the Middle East. And it now appears earlier having iron technology as well. So it's long past time to give all of Africa its proper due in the history of mankind, and I hope we are able to somehow move that venture forward. It's a difficult one to do. We live in a cultural world that we didn't make, but we're in it, so there we are.
Wagwan kings and queens, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I welcome you with honor, with respect, with love. Thank you so much for tuning on this space. Once again, this is where we talk about the truth, we talk about power and awakening. Today, I'm going to dive into what we need to hear, what we need to know, what we need to learn. The lie that ancient Egypt was not black, the lie that Africa had nothing to do with civilization, the lie that your ancestors were only slaves, only colonized people, only victims. And I'm going to refer to a video of the great Professor Nathan Huygens, who reminded us that in his lecture that the truth is the opposite. Africa did not borrow civilization, Africa gave civilization. Ancient Egypt, Kemet, the land of the black soil and the black people, was one of the greatest Africa achievement in human history. They even put a lie that Egypt is not in Africa. And the reason they erased our image, we are going to talk about that, the reason they whitewashed Egypt, and the reason all these lies came to pass. And this is because if black people knew who truly they were, if we understood that we came from builders of pyramids, from masters of science, from rulers of empires, then the system of oppression could not hold us down. So today, family, we are going to listen on this video of what Professor Huygens said about this great theft of history and why reclaiming this truth is not just about history books, it's about our liberation today. First of all, Nathan Huygens is a historian and professor who specialized in African American history, slavery and race in America. He was a Harvard professor and director of the W.E.B. Boyce Institute. Okay, in this lecture that we are going to listen, he has talked about African rules of civilization, race and erasure in history, the black Egyptian question, the struggle for identity, and etc. etc. So I want you to watch this video, and then I'll come back with my commentary because I have a lot to say about it, okay? Stay tuned. Make sure you comment down there, you like this video, and you share to the people you think might want to listen this one.
Scenes. So, my beginning comment here, ancient Egypt was in Africa. We can't really doubt that, can we? It's in the continent. But more important, ancient Egypt was of Africa. And that, of course, is not the way the past 2 centuries of Western scholarship have generally presented its history. It's long past time, I would say, for all of us to discard a whole set of old notions about Egypt, notions rooted in really the self-serving racialist presumptions of 19th century Europeans, notions that only too often people even today simply assume. They've never thought to examine those ideas. They're back in the background informing our minds even when we're not aware they are. And on the historical and the scholarly level, that re-examination is underway. The most recent, maybe we should say generations, the last 30 years or so, of scholars and scholarship on Nubia and Egypt are bringing together a whole new body, and maybe I should say whole new bodies of evidence, revealing the African rootedness of pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egyptian culture. By the way, this is just going off here for a second. Some of you may have seen or heard about a recent genetics article that makes the ancient Egyptians out to be Levantines. Let me be very clear, these findings come from one locale in a large stretch of possible locales in northern Egypt, and the finds date well after the foundational periods of ancient Egypt. It's somewhat as if, I was thinking of this particular image, rather than investigating DNA from a 17th century cemetery in Plymouth, we instead choose to investigate DNA from a later 19th century cemetery in South Boston. And then we conclude, having done that the United States was founded by people of Irish descent, and that Americans were predominantly are predominantly Irish. Well, that isn't necessarily how the writers of the article meant it to be interpreted, but that's certainly the way I've had people interpreting it to me. Even someone with a Coptic, seemed to be a Coptic last name from the sounds of things, berating me for being such a terrible human being all these years of my whole career, for ever having thought of Egypt as being African. So anyway, there is a deeper problem here. Genetics may be able to tell us about the different elements in our individual genetic, physical ancestries that we may have partake in, come from in our individual selves. But genes do not at all determine language. It's our own historical, cultural, life experiences, personal experiences that determine what languages speak, not our genes. And we need only look around at each other here in the room to know the truth of that. And it is these experiences also that shape our culture choices and our choice of cultural self-identification. Again, not our genes, it's our historical and cultural experiences. Now, the stories that I want to tell today explore the developments that laid the cultural and language foundations of ancient Egypt, developments beginning before, sometimes long before, 3100 BCE. Now, the foundational areas of Egypt also, of ancient Egypt, also encompass not northern Egypt, but a whole range of lands extending far across northeastern Africa. And there are actually two ancient Egyptian foundational stories that I'd like to tell, and so that gives me an opportunity to change our slide. Well, one of these we might call the deep time story, the story of cultural and historical developments from the 6th millennium on down to around 3100 BCE. And the setting of this story was what was then a wide swath of steppe grassland, not some narrow strip of habitable land just along the river, extending for more than 1,000 kilometers, extending north-south from beyond the confluence of the Blue and White Nile in the south to as far north as the archaeological sites at El Badari in Middle Egypt. It was this vast stretch of lands that constituted the foundational cultural regions and the cultural heartland of pre-dynastic Egypt. But there is also a second story, what one might call the way deep time story, with its beginnings before 15,000 BCE. And the setting for the way deep time story takes us even farther south in northeastern Africa. So to give things their proper historical order, let's do first things first. Let's begin with that earlier way deep story. In doing so, we'll consider the kinds of historical evidence that I'm particularly known for applying, comparative linguistic and cultural evidence along with archaeology. To excavate this history, we must set out, first of all, the language relationships of ancient Egyptian. Now, ancient Egyptian belonged to the Afroasiatic language family. Small digression here. There is an older name for the Afroasiatic family, a horrendously bad name. The alternative name, Hamito-Semitic. You recognize the name Ham, of course, here in Hamito. To still use that name today is to perpetuate the horrific invention by racists of a myth used to justify enslaving Africans. And it's the slaver's own myth. It's not truly biblical. That Ham was the ancestor of all Africans, so they could get the Africans they wanted into their myth. That God had passed Noah's curse on to Ham's supposed descendants by giving them dark skins. And even more horrifying to me, still in our own day, I've been discovering there are only too many American fundamentalist Christians who still hold to this myth. It's really shocking and sad to see. So avoid this name as if it were the plague, or indeed the 7 plagues of ancient Egypt. So back to our topic. 3 initiating questions this really requires from us. First, how and when did the language directly ancestral to ancient Egyptian come to be spoken along the Egyptian Nile? And answering that question requires 2 other questions to answer. Where does the ancient Egyptian fit in the family tree of relationships within the Afroasiatic language family? And where were the languages of the family most probably spoken at different points along the lines of descent in the family tree, which we haven't quite yet shown you? So first we need to view the family tree of Afroasiatic. What I'm going to do is treat a little series of slides here, tracking the lines of descent of ancient Egyptian back to the original Proto-Afroasiatic language. So there, that gets you to ancient Egyptian, and back through these successive earlier stages back to Proto-Afroasiatic, the mother language of the whole family. Now, these findings, by the way, are very similar to ones that have been previously published, but the version that is here is coming from the ongoing work of a team of scholars that I brought together. We've combined some newer mathematical approaches, ones that are actually used in the genetics field, along with traditional methods of working out language and language family genealogies. What languages are closely related to each other and which are farther, and so on. A first presentation of our findings is currently in the process of publication, and well, you know, the evidence is like, oh God, so much of it. Anyway, but I'd really probably be happy to talk with people about what goes into it, and we'll have to wait a few more months for the material starts to be out, and I get all the materials up online for people to see. But as I say, I'd be a little happy to talk with people about this a little bit afterwards. Now, in your handout, you will see that there is a bibliography, and so on that bibliography you can find some articles that refer to the history, and actually to a variety of different topics that are related to what we're talking about. So our second question: where would the daughter languages of the family have been spoken at successive eras in the language family history? Well, to answer this question, we apply some long-established standard tools for inferring historical geography from comparative ethnography and linguistics. So on the bibliography, I did cite myself, but I cited the classic work from 1916 by Edward Sapir that brought all of these different methods together, but there's been a long history of scholars using these in fruitful and very useful and ways that normally have worked out give an answer that works in the long term. So two primary methods apply in proposing the ancient locations of people. The first is the principle of fewest moves, often called least moves, but I'm a little uncomfortable because moves should have fewest, not least, but anyway, sorry being a grammatical whatever I am here. To state this principle in plain terms, the most probable history of a spread of a language family is the history that most parsimoniously, we're getting to Occam's razor here, accounts for the later locations of the languages of the family. The most probable history is, in other words, the history that requires the fewest and the most direct and straightforward movements of people into new lands, people who speak languages of the family. And a second principle, which is related, we might call the center of diversity principle. What anthropologists long ago discovered is that the areas where a particular complex of cultural practices shows the greatest diversity in the particular ways the individual practices are carried out or expressed is the region where the complex is usually the oldest. And the guiding idea behind this, of course, is that the longer a set of cultural ideas or practices have been existed in an area, the more time it has had for people to develop in different cultures, different subcultures within that area, to develop their own new varieties and new features of those ideas. Well, in similar fashion, we can use this principle for language families. If there is a region where the earliest branching of a language family, where the earliest branchings of that family cluster close to each other, that will be most likely the region where the languages of the family have longest been spoken. So, how do these principles apply to ancient Egyptian? Well, the geography of the successive branchings of the Afroasiatic tree puts it beyond doubt in my mind, beyond reasonable doubt is the term I would use, that the family originated somewhere in the Horn of Africa, in and around that region, and two, that speakers of the languages of the family then spread in a step-by-step succession of advances outward from the Horn. So back to the family tree. And here I've underlined a few key groups so that you can see when, be able to identify them when we get to them. The tracking of this history begins with the first two divergences of the family. Initially, the Proto-Afroasiatic language diverged into two daughter languages. Each daughter language was ancestral to one of the two primary branches of the family. You can see we have two primary branches way up at the top of the tree. One was Proto-Omotic. I hope that arrow popped up so you can see it. Proto-Omotic, and that's ancestral to the Omotic branch of the family. And then there's a second proto-language, Proto-Erythraic, ancestral to the rest of the family. We've given the name Erythraic, that is to say Red Sea, knowing our ancient history, everyone here, of course. This is this second primary branch for geographical regions that will start to become apparent as we map the next several stages in this history. Now, at the second stage of early Afroasiatic history, the Erythraic branch then itself diverged into the Proto-Erythraic language diverged into two daughter languages. That branch, in other words, began to develop into two secondary branches of its own. One of these branches was shall I go back again there because I popped it up too quick? The Cushitic branch. Okay. Now, this branch continued over the long course of its history to be spoken in regions in and around the Horn of Africa. So we'll, let's see what we get here. So we'll go on to that in a minute. Now, the evidence is clear and straightforward. The first two periods of divergence in the family took place somewhere broadly in or around. I'm wondering what happened to two. There we go. Let's take it back to here. What we'll do is, we'll look at it this way. Here we had, let's look first at where the Omatic branch is located on the map. Then here's where the Cushitic family, at its widest expansion, it's not as widely expanded anymore, but around 1000 BCE, but it's all around the Horn of Africa. Okay, so that's our two things. The first two branches took place in and around the Horn of Africa. Now, still later, we need postulate just two further single, we need the third stage of the history, we need to postulate just a single additional advance northward. The spread, if we take ourselves back to the tree, the Proto-North Erythraic, shall I make its arrow pop in there? Proto-North Erythraic. Okay, let's taking ourselves onward. It requires only a single expansion northward out of the northern part of the Horn of Africa to spread the North Erythraic branch northward. And still later in time, we only have to postulate two further single expansions outward from the Egyptian corner of Africa to account for the remaining divisions of the family, with the speakers of the language distantly ancestral to the much later Semitic languages, crossing Sinai from Egypt to the Levant, and with the speakers of the ancestral language of the Chadic and Amazigh. Amazigh is what Berbers prefer to call themselves these days. A Chado-Amazigh branch spreading somewhat later west from the Nile across the Sahara. Now, just how long ago did this succession of developments begin? So finally, our third step. Archaeology excavates the material artifacts of earlier cultures. And the dating methods of archaeology allow one to then date the artifacts to particular periods in the past. At the same time, we can also excavate language for the linguistic artifacts of the past. How? Well, by reconstructing the culture vocabularies, and sometimes I may use the word lexicon because I get a little more technical sounding now and then, but okay. Vocabulary lexicon. The culture vocabularies of languages spoken in earlier ages. The words used in those languages reveal to us the variety of things that the people who spoke the languages possessed, what they did, what they knew, what they believed, and so forth. If a past word had, a society had words for a particular thing or a particular activity, then at the very least they knew of that activity or thing. If we can reconstruct whole suites of words relating to a particular area of culture, then we know that that collection of things or behaviors or ideas were a lively part of their culture. And if the cultural suites include items that could include words for notable features of material culture features that are liable to be or likely to be preserved in the archaeological record, we can do something else. We can search the archaeological record for the times and places where those assemblages of material cultural items occur. So what do the word histories of Afroasiatic reveal? I'm giving you a little hint ahead there. And I've also put data in your handouts. Well, the most important for archaeological correlation, the words that we can reconstruct back to earlier and earlier periods reveal that the Proto-Afroasiatic people were already harvesters of wild grains. So on red, we've written the fact that, oh yes, there's a subsistence vocabulary. You look in your handout, I've given you particular sets of words that we can track back to each successively more recent stage in history. That's the way I made up the list. So, and this economic focus then continued right down through the early nodes, the early periods in the Afroasiatic tree. Now, I've proposed elsewhere that the adoption of grain harvesting was very probably a response to the climate changes around the period of the last glacial maximum. This period peaked around the 20th millennium BCE, and widely across Africa at that time, climates became drier, significantly drier. And the results in the Horn would have been the shrinking back of forested areas and the expansion of grassland areas with edible wild grains, especially in the northern Ethiopian highlands and the northern edges of those highlands. So, if we are to seek out archaeological correlations for this new kind of subsistence economy, now the salient question is, what would the diagnostic archaeological markers be? Well, there is one particular kind of item that is determinative of this economy, and it's an item that survives well in the archaeology, much better than the grains itself. And that item is a small sickle-shaped stone blade with a particular surface feature, a kind of sheen caused specifically by the repeated cutting off over time of many ears of grain. Is there such a marker in the tool of in the tool record of the northeastern African archaeology? Yes, there is. Now, for most of the period of several years around the glacial maximum, our archaeological knowledge of the farther northern Ethiopian highlands is really minimal because so few sites have been studied. But there is one notable exception, Laga Oda, which is down at the very bottom of the slide. Laga Oda is located at the northeastern margin of the highlands near the modern-day city of Diridawa. And the findings of Laga Oda fit right in with the predictions of the ancient Afro-Asiatic word histories. And the occupation at Laga Oda dates back to around 16,000 BCE, calibrated date. Already in its earliest levels, we can find those key diagnostic items, the small blades bearing the sheen, the telltale sheen, shall we call it, of harvesting. Now, because we lack archaeological sites from the region for the crucial foundational period immediately preceding, we don't know yet how much earlier this adaptation, let's put that back for a moment. Okay. Adaptation may have begun. My own expectation, as I indicated, is that we may find that wild grain harvesting goes back to the high point of the glacial maximum, maybe before 18,000 BCE. But more directly germane for our study, the earliest finds at Laga Oda belong to the era immediately preceding the first appearance of the new kind of tool and economy in Egypt. So, in Egypt, this new economic orientation and its determinative tool arrived 1,000 years later, around 15,000 BCE, and these features came as part of the arrival along the Egyptian Nile of a new culture, the Ophian culture, and also there's a variety of it a little farther south of Aswan, which I'm not mentioning in case someone thought I didn't know about that one, but okay. Anyway, now, so what might account for the timing of this economic and archaeological changeover, this cultural and economic changeover? Well, in that very period, between 16,000 and 15,000 BCE, the first amelioration of the extreme dry climate of the glacial maximum began in areas along both sides of the Red Sea, in the form of somewhat increased rainfall, actual enough rainfall on the African side and on the Arabian side during that millennium to support an expansion of grassland steppe. And for our purposes, grassland steppe right through the chain of hills and middling mountains that connect the northern Horn of Africa and Upper Egypt. The Red Sea Hills, as they tend to be called. So in effect, the climatic amelioration opened an environmental pathway in the 16th millennium for the potential spread of the wild grain harvesting economy as far north as Egypt. Now, moving on from that, who might have been the people then that could have taken advantage and moved that economy northward to Egypt? Well, the linguistic maps of the successive earlier periods of Afro-Asiatic divergence that we briefly looked at They offer one strong possibility. So let's go back to those maps, and we'll put ourselves at this particular stage of history. And that is the divergence of the Proto-Northeast Eritreic speakers out of the earlier Eritreic community. The geographically most parsimonious spread line would be along the Red Sea Hills. Now, this is not a story of population replacement when we look at the archaeology. In the archaeology, some of the older tool-making techniques of the previous existing Egyptian Nile people of before 15,000 BCE got adopted into the overall Ophian toolkit. The way deep time story history that I'm proposing here is that it's in part a story of the arrival of new people from farther south in Africa, bringing a new subsistence economy and cultural ideas north to the Egyptian Nile regions. But it's a story, too, of the melding of the immigrants and the existing populations into a new society, with a new language and probably the adoption of new cultural ideas and practices that came along with the immigrants. Now, one caveat, archaeologically, this proposed history fits the current evidence, currently available evidence, but there is one notable gap. We have no archaeology for the crucial millennium in the crucial intervening lands along the Red Sea Hills. But the history I pose at least does raise a testable proposition for future archaeological investigation. It tells us what I am expecting we should find. The evidence of the spread of a wild grain economy in the 16th millennium BCE through the Red Sea Hills. Now, then, just to go back briefly before we take ourselves back into Egypt, back to the two subsequent eras of divergence, as we've seen. I guess, did I decide not to put? Yeah, I did. There we go. There's the movement of taking a very, very early language that's much, much later going to evolve into Proto-Semitic. And we also have the still later expansion westward, the Sahara. I think we're going to demonstrate eventually that the Chadic, the Chado-Amazigh movement was connected with the rise of the Holocene wet phase. So it probably goes to the 9th, maybe 10th, or later 10th millennium BCE. Anyway, now among the Afroasiatic speakers who stayed in the lands on both sides of the Egyptian Nile, changes did take place in the archaeological materials over the long period from 15,000 BCE down to much later times. But here's the key point. The archaeology within Egypt indicates that overall, a broad cultural continuity extended from the Ophian period down into much later times. With new developments, yes, but with no evidence, sharp, clear evidence of notable cultural or archaeological breaks. Wilma Wetterström, I love to try to pronounce names where I can use my linguistic background, 25 years ago argued very cogently, putting all these materials together, that this cultural continuity in fact extended right across the transition into the later eras from wild grain harvesting to the adoption of domesticated crops, and to the adoption of domesticated grains spreading in from the Levant, and also the spread of African crops from farther south, northward into Egypt.
Welcome back. Now, you have heard the lecture. It's an eye-opening. And coming from a white professor, it's something that we all need to learn. We all need to hear. Because in Kenya, we always say stories are jaba. Stories are jaba is a Swahili word, means that just cookery stories. But about Egypt history is not cookery, it's not forgery. It is real. But what they present to us, what they have always presented to us for years, it's forgery. It is lies. And that's why we seek the truth. And I know all of you, some of you knows about this, but to my upcoming generation, to my Gen Zs, to my youths, this is for you. And to my aged people who want to learn more, this is for you. And I want to talk about why Egypt matters. I want to talk why Egypt is important. I want to talk why is there a battle over who the Egyptians were. Because the answer is very simple. Egypt is the crown jewel of civilization. It's a jewel of prosperity. When people think of the first written language, when people think of the first mathematicians, or mathematics, when people think of the first medicine, when people think of the first architect, the first organized religion, they think of Egypt. Whoever controls the story of Egypt controls the story of civilization itself. And for centuries, Western scholars, historians, and politicians have tried to make Egypt look like a European project, at least a Middle Eastern one detached from Africa. But as Professor Higgins pointed out, you cannot detach Egypt from Africa. Egypt is on the African continent. Egypt was connected deeply to Nubia, to Kush, to Ethiopia, and the very word Kemet means the black land. The soil was black, the people were black, the kings and queens were black, and yet Western history books tried to remove that truth. And that's why Egypt matters. They are trying to hide the real faces of the ancient Egypt, but I'll tell you this. Looking at the evidence, the tombs, the temples, the hieroglyphs, they are filled with paintings of Africans with dark skin, with tightly curled hair, with wide noses, with full lips. Like the paintings are all black. You see pharaohs like Ramses, Thutmose, and even the Kushite pharaohs on the 25th dynasty all clearly have African appearances. Archaeologists have uncovered mummies whose DNA links them not only to North Africa, but also to Sub-Saharan Africa. So the very blood of the Nile carried African identity, and yet when Nollywood makes a movie about Cleopatra, they cast a white actress. When you walk into museums in London or Paris, you see broken statues of Pharaoh with noses smashed. Why? Why are the noses smashed off? It's because those noses revealed African features. You hear me? On Professor Higgins' lecture has warned us that this erasure is not an accident, it is a strategy. And the reason why they erased Black Egypt is what we are going to say. But before we talk about that, let me ask you this question. Why do you think they erased us? Why? Tell me in the comment section. Why would they take Egypt out of Africa? And the answer is found in slavery and colonization. Okay? When Europeans began the transatlantic slave trade, they needed to justify it. They needed to convince themselves and the world that black people are inferior. They needed to convince the world that Africans had contributed nothing to civilization. But how are they going to make it happen? How are they going to justify their argument of greater civilization? How are going to justify their argument if Egypt was black? Now, so what they did, they began the whitewashing. They began teaching in universities that Egypt was Mediterranean, that it had no more in common with Greece or with Greece than with Africa. And they started portraying pharaohs with lighter skin, straighter nose, different features. They invited the myth of Caucasian North Africans who somehow were separate from their African brothers and sisters to the south. Professor Higgins said this was not just a lie about history. It was a weapon. By erasing Black Egypt, they erased the memory of black power. They erased the evidence that black people were rulers, scientists, and priests, mathematicians, and doctors. Okay? And the theft of knowledge began. It is thieving. It is thefty. Robbery without violence. But I think it was with violence. Theft of knowledge. Do you know where the Greeks got their philosophy? From Egypt. Where mathematicians in Europe got their knowledge? From Egypt. Do you know where medical science came from? Egypt. The Greek historian admitted it himself. He said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. He described Egyptians as melanchthros. Black-skinned people. Melanchthros come from the one melanin. Melanchthros, black-skinned people. Okay? But centuries later, Western historians twisted his words. They tried to claim Egypt was separate from Africa. They claimed that Greece invented philosophy on its own. They represented Europe as the center of the knowledge. Professor Higgins made it clear This was deliberately theft. They stole African knowledge, claimed it as their own, and then told Africans they had no history. You see the broken noses on the pyramid and you ask yourself why. This was a strategy. Because when you walk into the British Museum, when you step into the museum, I think in Paris, when you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, you will see Egyptian statues, and many of them have missing noses. And this is not coincidence, it is strategy. Why would so many statues of Pharaoh and queens all lose their noses? Because those noses were wide. Those noses told the truth about African identity. So by smashing the nose, they erased the African features, leaving only the structure itself. So it became easier for historians to say these people were not black. They were something else because there is no nose. You cannot tell. This act of vandalism was historical cover-up. It was not just about breaking stones. It was about breaking memory. Man, everything that the system does it by design. When you go to the Hollywood movies, right now in our modern times, they play a big role in shaping how people imagine the past. When you think of Cleopatra, who do you see? You see Elizabeth Taylor, a white woman. When movies show Egyptian queens and kings, they often use Arabs or European actors. This is what we call psychological welfare, because when young black children when they grow up seeing white people playing the role of their ancestors, they grow up believing that greatness belonged to someone else. So they are disconnected from the truth. They are disconnected from the roots from day one they grow up. But the truth is, Cleopatra herself had African ancestry, okay? But Egypt itself was still deeply African too. And before Cleopatra, thousands of years of African pharaohs ruled the land. That is the reality. That is the reality. Now, Professor Huygens always emphasized that Egypt did not stand alone. It was connected to Nubia and Kush, lands in what in today it is Sudan. The 25th dynasty, the Kushite pharaohs ruled Egypt with pride, and they were unapologetically African. Their images, their temples, their tombs all show black kings and queens leading Egypt. So how can anyone say Egypt was not African when its own rulers were Nubians? How? But the answer is clearly, they can only say it by lying, by ignoring the evidence, and by rewriting the story. That's how they change everything. When Europe realized that when Europe colonized Africa, they did not just take land and resources, they took history. They went into Africa, stole artifacts, stole sacred texts, and then locked them in European museum. And they told Africans that they were primitive, they had no history. Professor Huygens explained that the erasure of Black Egypt was part of colonial philosophy. If Africans believed that they were always slaves, always colonized, always poor, then they will never rise. But if Africans knew the truth, that they built the pyramids, that they created medicine, that they invented writing, then the colonial lie would collapse. And today the truth is rising again. Scholars, historians, and archaeologists from Africa and African diaspora are reclaiming Egypt. DNA evidence, archaeology evidence, linguistic evidence, they all confirm the African identity of ancient Egypt. And young people right now from Kenya to Ghana, America, Caribbean, they are reconnecting with Egypt as part of their heritage. They are saying that we are not just the descendants of slaves, we are the descendants of pharaohs. And this is why the system still fights so hard to whitewash Egypt, because the truth is dangerous. The truth is dangerous, but truth will set everyone free. Now, the ancient Egypt had a language, and when you study closely, it shows deep connection with the other African languages. Sheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese scholar, spent years comparing Egyptians with Wolof, a language spoken in West Africa. He found striking similarities in vocabulary, in grammar, and in structure. And that means one thing: Egypt was not a random outpost in Africa. It was part of the African family of language and structures and cultures. Just as you trace connection between English and German, or between Spanish and Italian, you can trace Egypt back to African roots. Professor Higgins explained the Western linguistic deliberately ignored this connection. They tried to group Egypt or to group Egyptian with Semitic language instead of Africans ones. And they did this because they wanted to pull Egypt away from Africa. They wanted to make it look Middle Eastern. But the truth is, there in the language itself, Egypt spoke African tongues. Even when you talk about the spirituality, the Egyptian gods and goddesses were African in essence. Osiris, Isis, Horus, Ra. These deities were not imported from Europe. They were born of African soil, shaped by African imaginations. Even the idea of resurrection, the idea of life after death, the idea of judgment before the gods, these spiritual systems came from Africa. When you look at Christianity, you see echoes of Egypt. The story of the Holy Child born of a virgin, watched over by a divine mother, prosecuted by evil forces. The story existed in Egypt long before it appeared in the Bible. And Professor Higgins taught us that Egypt was the bridge where African spirituality shaped the religion of the world. But again, the story was twisted. Instead of giving credit to African priests or thinkers, they erased the connection and claimed that these ideas were European inventions. We must never forget that Egypt was part of the larger network of African civilization too. Civilizations. Nubia, Kush, Meroe, Axum. The lands were connected through trade, culture, through blood. Even the Nile itself was Africa's lifeline. From the south to the north, the river connected African peoples. Ideas flowed, goods flowed, people flowed, man. You cannot understand Egypt without understanding Nubia. You cannot understand the pharaohs without understanding Kushite kings. But what did Western historians did? They tried to chop Egypt off from the rest of Africa as if it was some foreign island. They drew maps that put Egypt in the Middle East instead of Africa. They told us Africa had no great civilization while sitting in museums filled with Africans' artifacts. And Professor Higgins called this. He called this intellectual colonization. They colonized even the map, even the categories of geography to make us forget about African greatness. You know, one of the greatest scholars to reclaim Egypt was Sheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese professor. In the 1970s, at the UNESCO conference, he stood before the world's leading Egyptologists and presented scientific proof that the ancient Egypt were black. He used melanin test on mummies. He compared languages. He showed cultural continuation or continuities between Egypt and other African societies. The reaction from European scholars was anger, denial, rejection, but they could not disapprove his evidence. They simply refused to accept it. They did that because to accept it would mean rewriting centuries of lies, Another great warrior who presented the truth about Egypt was Dr. John Henry Clark. I will talk about him this video sometimes. He said history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of the day. If you don't know your history, you don't know what time it is. You are lost then. Clark explained that the erasure of Black Egypt was part of the plan to keep black people lost. Because if we think that our history begins with slavery, then we believe we were always at the bottom. But if we know our history begins with Egypt, with Kush, Mali, Great Zimbabwe, then we see ourselves as builders of nations. When you talk about the British museums, these institutions are not neutral. They are not innocent. They are a warehouse of stolen African history. When you walk in these museums, you see Egyptians' artifacts taken from African soil. You see pharaoh displayed as trophies. But you also see how they presented it. They are labeled as Mediterranean. They are framed as somehow separate from Africa. And Professor Higgins at this said this was not preservation, it was colonization. Museum colonized memory. They held our history hostage and then told us lies about it. And this is why Africans and the diaspora must demand the return of our artifacts. Because as long as they control our memory, they control our future. You get me? And the biggest battlefield for this lie is education. In schools across the world, children are taught about civilization, that it began in Greece and Rome. Egypt is mentioned, but always in connection to Europe. Black children rarely see themselves in those history books as children of colonized people. So in school too, all of education has played a lot on shaping this history. It's not our history. And they fear black power because the erasure of black Egypt is about fear. The fear of black power, the fear of black unity, the fear of black knowledge. Because if we all know the truth, if Africans, African Americans and Caribbeans all know the truth, even Afro-Latinos, if all of us knew that we came from pharaohs, from the pyramid builders, then no one could stop us. The system of white supremacy depends on our ignorance, depends on us believing that we are powerless. And today, science is catching up with our elders always. Science is catching up with our elders, or what our elders told, or what our elders knew. DNA studies show connection between ancient Egyptians and population further south in Africa. Archaeology reveals African features, African traditions, African practices. But have you noticed how mainstream media presents this evidence? They downplay it, they twist it, they say Egyptians were not black, they were just, diverse. They invent new categories, new terms to avoid saying the truth that they were just Africans. And this, what it means today, it means that because history is identity, if we believe we were always slaves, we behave like slaves. If we believe that we were always colonized, we behave like colonized people. But if we know we were kings and queens, if we know we were scientists and builders, then we rise with the pride. And that's what we need to do as black people. Africans, black Americans, black Caribbeans, Afro-Latinos, we need to know our history. History is like a clock. It tells you how you were back then. It gives you energy. We need to rise as black people. We need to learn about history, teach our children about history, learn about the true Egypt, learn about everything. Let's not ignore this. Let's not saying that it's past. No. They are using this to control the future. We need to learn that. Until next episode, peace out.